The sun was just beginning to rise over the city, painting the streets with soft golden light, and the governor was driving his black SUV through the busy avenues, heading to an important meeting downtown. He had a long day ahead, with back-to-back appointments, community events, and a press briefing later in the afternoon, but for now, he enjoyed the quiet moment in his car. Listening to soft music and watching the city come alive, the streets were filled with morning commuters, buses rolling past, cyclists weaving through traffic, and the occasional jogger greeting the day with energy and enthusiasm. Everything seemed ordinary, peaceful, and routine, exactly the kind of start he liked before diving into the challenges of leadership. Unbeknownst to him, a police officer sat in a patrol car a few blocks ahead, casually scanning the road, waiting for an excuse to pull someone over. This officer was experienced in routine traffic stops but carried a subtle bias that often clouded his judgment. Today, he noticed the governor's car and immediately felt an unnecessary sense of authority and control. Something about the driver's presence triggered an instinct to assert power rather than perform a fair and lawful check. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel impatiently, waiting for the right moment, unaware that he was about to make a choice that would change the course of the morning. As the governor approached a busy intersection, the officer switched on his lights and siren, signaling him to pull over. The governor noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and calmly pulled to the side of the road, maintaining a steady speed and smooth maneuvering. He rolled down the window as the officer approached, greeting him politely with a nod. His demeanor was calm, professional, and unthreatening, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes that suggested he was no ordinary driver. The officer, however, seemed blind to this, approaching with a sense of superiority, expecting immediate compliance and perhaps a little fear. Bystanders walking on the sidewalk noticed the interaction, their curiosity piqued by the sudden stop. Some slowed down, pulling out their phones to record, sensing that this might not be a routine traffic stop. The morning air was filled with tension, a quiet hum of anticipation from drivers waiting at the intersection and pedestrians wondering what was happening. Inside the SUV, the governor checked his documents calmly, making sure everything was in order. His mind ran through the protocol, knowing that any reaction would be noticed, any slip could escalate the situation. He reminded himself to stay composed, no matter what, because dignity and patience were his strongest tools in moments like this. The officer, on the other hand, walked around the SUV with a stiff posture, eyes narrowing as he looked at the governor. He assumed the driver would be nervous, but instead, he saw only confidence and clarity. This challenged the officer's expectations, creating a flicker of doubt that he quickly tried to suppress. He opened the car door slightly and leaned in, his voice firm but tinged with impatience, asking for license and registration, expecting the driver to fumble or hesitate. But the governor handed over the documents immediately, politely and respectfully, yet with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirping of birds from the trees lining the street. The governor's calm presence seemed to amplify the officer's discomfort, though he refused to admit it. The situation, which could have been ordinary and mundane, began to take on a heavier weight. Every gesture, every word, and every look mattered now. Even the smallest action could shift the balance of power. In that moment, the city seemed to pause, as if aware that a confrontation was building quietly in its heart. Despite the tension, the governor never lost his composure, smiling politely and responding to the officer with calm and measured words. He knew the importance of patience, of maintaining control through calmness rather than aggression. He understood that fear or anger would only give the officer an upper hand. The governor's mind was clear, thinking about the rules, the law, and the greater responsibility he carried. This was more than a traffic stop, it was a test of character, and he was determined to pass it without conflict. The officer, still focused on asserting authority, did not realize he had underestimated the person in front of him, and the morning was about to take a surprising turn. As the minutes passed, small details began to matter. The way the governor placed his hands on the steering wheel, the tone of his voice, even the slight smile that conveyed calm confidence. Bystanders continued to watch, sensing the tension in the air, and some whispered to each other. Realizing this was no ordinary traffic stop, the city hummed around them, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding. But for those involved, it was a moment that could change reputations, challenge assumptions, and ultimately reveal the truth about courage, dignity, and respect. The routine stop was no longer routine, and both men were about to face a moment they would never forget. The officer leaned slightly closer to the governor's window, his voice firm but carrying an unmistakable edge, asking why he had been stopped. The governor met his gaze calmly, his eyes steady and unflinching, responding politely that he was driving through his normal route to a scheduled meeting. Handing over his documents without hesitation, the officer's hand tightened slightly on the folder he held. His bias simmering beneath the surface, he had expected hesitation, nervousness, maybe even fear, but instead, he faced quiet confidence and clear authority, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The governor spoke with respect, using words carefully chosen to maintain calm and avoid escalation. "Good morning, officer, I'm just on my way to an official engagement. Here are my documents," he said, his tone steady and reassuring, yet firm enough to signal he understood his rights and the proper protocol. The officer glanced at the papers, scanning them briefly, but his mind was clouded with assumptions. He wanted to assert dominance, to show he had the upper hand, but every polite word, every measured gesture from the governor chipped away at his confidence, creating a tension that seemed almost tangible. Around them, the city carried on, but pedestrians and drivers nearby couldn't help but notice the encounter. Some slowed down to watch, sensing the unusual dynamic between the two men. Phones emerged, recording discreetly, capturing every word, every glance. The atmosphere was charged, subtle but undeniable, as if the air itself was aware that this confrontation was more than a routine traffic stop. It was a collision of power, prejudice, and integrity, and neither man would walk away unchanged. The officer straightened his posture, trying to hide the uncertainty creeping into his mind. He asked more questions, probing for answers that could justify his stop, questioning details as if looking for a mistake. The governor responded carefully, never raising his voice, never showing frustration, yet each response was precise, intelligent, and legally correct. He knew exactly how to navigate this delicate moment, turning what the officer thought would be a display of authority into a lesson. In professionalism, the officer felt the shift, a slow realization that the man before him was not only aware of the law but also confident in his ability to enforce it if necessary. "You understand the law, sir?" the officer asked, his voice slightly tighter now, betraying his growing unease. The governor nodded politely. "Yes, officer, and I always follow proper procedures. I believe we can resolve this quickly and correctly." His calm composure acted like a mirror, reflecting the officer's tension back to him, and it made the officer more defensive than before. He shifted his weight, glanced around at the bystanders, and tried to regain control, but it was slipping through his fingers. The situation drew attention from a few bystanders, who began whispering among themselves, noting the odd tension in the officer's posture and the governor's composed demeanor. Some raised their phones subtly, capturing the moment. Already, the officer's behavior was being recorded, an unintended witness to his bias and misjudgment. The governor, aware of this, did not panic or react with arrogance. He maintained his calm, polite smile, knowing that dignity and patience were his strongest allies in this situation. The officer's words became sharper, more defensive. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, trying to regain the authority he felt slipping away. The governor responded with measured politeness. "Officer, I understand your duty, and I respect your role. I am simply ensuring all my documentation is in order as required by law." His tone was respectful, but the firmness in his voice made it clear he would not be intimidated. This subtle power struggle continued, the officer realizing more with every passing second that he had underestimated the man in front of him. Time seemed to stretch, every second heavy with tension, as the governor remained calm and composed, never flinching, never raising his voice. His body language radiated quiet authority, signaling he was aware of the officer's bias without needing to confront it aggressively. The officer, feeling the eyes of the surrounding pedestrians and the weight of being observed, began to falter. The confrontation, once seeming routine and simple, had turned into a silent lesson about power, composure, and respect. Neither man needed to raise a hand or shout, yet the impact of this moment was already profound. As the tense exchange continued, the attention of passers-by began to shift from casual curiosity to genuine concern. People walking along the sidewalk slowed down, noticing the unusual posture of the officer and the calm confidence of the governor in the driver's seat. Some stopped completely, tilting their heads to get a better view, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. a few drivers slowed their cars, glancing through rearview mirrors, the bright flash of the officer's lights catching their attention. In moments like this, the energy of the city seemed to bend around the encounter, a quiet anticipation filling the air. Among the onlookers, a young man holding a coffee cup whispered to his friend, "That doesn't look like a regular stop, something feels off." His friend nodded silently, pulling out his phone, trying to record without drawing attention. Meanwhile, a mother walking with her child glanced at the scene, her grip on the stroller tightening slightly, as though she could sense the tension radiating from the interaction. Even people several blocks away began to notice the flashing lights and the small crowd forming, their curiosity mixed with concern, wondering if the officer's judgment was fair or if something deeper was at play. The governor remained perfectly still, hands lightly resting on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the officer, yet his awareness extended beyond the patrol car, scanning the surroundings with quiet intelligence. He understood that bystanders, even unknowingly, could play a role in holding authority accountable. His calm demeanor reassured those watching, showing that courage did not always need to be loud or aggressive. It could be quiet, composed, and unwavering, a demonstration of strength that spoke louder than words. Inside the patrol car, the officer became increasingly aware of the eyes watching him, the whispering, the subtle recording of his actions, and the general attention from the crowd began to make him uneasy. He had expected compliance, maybe a little nervousness from the governor, but not this quiet defiance coupled with public observation. The tension shifted slightly. He was no longer just enforcing a routine stop. He was performing under scrutiny, though he refused to acknowledge it. The presence of witnesses amplified the stakes, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. A pedestrian wearing headphones discreetly started filming the interaction, zooming in to capture the calm, polite yet firm responses of the governor. Another bystander took a few steps closer, muttering softly, "He's handling this so well." Their observations created a ripple effect, a silent network of witnesses who could later recount the scene accurately. The governor, aware of this, did not show any sign of approval or acknowledgement. He did not need to, because his calm actions were already making the statement he wanted. Dignity, respect, and composure could disarm prejudice more effectively than confrontation. As minutes passed, the officer began to notice subtle signs of disapproval from the crowd, a few nods of support for the governor, a shake of the head toward him. It was a quiet pressure, almost invisible, yet profoundly felt. The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping the public attention would fade, but it didn't. Instead, the bystanders remained, some whispering, some recording, and all observing the unfolding situation with a mix of curiosity and silent judgment. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the encounter would end. Despite the growing audience, the governor remained unshaken, maintaining a polite smile and steady voice, answering the officer's questions with clarity and precision. He did not react to the silent judgment or the cameras. Instead, he focused on the proper steps, ensuring every word and gesture was lawful and composed. His calm authority began to overshadow the officer's aggression, creating a shift in energy that even the bystanders could feel. The scene, initially tense, now carried a subtle sense of empowerment for those watching, as if justice was quietly asserting itself through composure rather than confrontation. Finally, a few more people joined the small crowd, some lingering on their way to work, others stopping out of sheer curiosity. Each new set of eyes added to the invisible weight pressing on the officer. He was now fully aware that this was no ordinary stop, that the governor, through calm presence and quiet authority, had turned what could have been a simple power play into a moment of public accountability. The bystanders were no longer passive witnesses, they had become part of the story, silently holding the officer accountable, while the governor continued to demonstrate that courage and dignity could influence everyone around. The officer stood beside the SUV, trying to maintain control, but something inside him was beginning to shift. Every polite answer from the governor, every calm movement, seemed to chip away at the confidence he thought he had. He double-checked the governor's documents, flipping through them quickly, hoping to find a minor error or technicality that would justify his stop, but everything was in perfect order. Every license, registration, and identification was correct, current, and in proper format. The officer's frustration grew, and in his impatience, he made a critical mistake. asking a question in a way that went beyond protocol, attempting to challenge the governor rather than simply perform his duty. "Do you realize you were going faster than the limit back there?" the officer asked sharply, expecting the governor to hesitate, to admit guilt, maybe even apologize, but the governor looked at him with the same calm, measured gaze that had unsettled him from the beginning. "Officer, I was well within the speed limit, and my driving complies with all traffic regulations," he replied politely, his voice steady and composed. Yet firm. It was a simple correction, but it hit the officer harder than any argument could have. He had assumed fear or hesitation, but instead he was faced with knowledge and authority. The officer's mistake became more obvious as he tried to assert his authority verbally. "I can write a citation if I want to," he said, his tone sharper, attempting to regain control. The governor, unshaken, leaned slightly forward, still polite but unmistakably assertive. "Officer, you have every right to follow protocol, but I believe all documents are in order, and no violation has occurred," he said. Each word reflected not arrogance but clarity, understanding, and composure, highlighting the officer's error in judgment. Around them, the bystanders began to notice the subtle shift. The initial tension, which had been centered on the confrontation, now turned to curiosity about the officer's reaction. Whispers ran through the small crowd, and phones continued to record, capturing the growing unease. Some bystanders exchanged glances, nodding slightly toward the governor. Recognizing that calmness and dignity were quietly taking control of the situation, the officer, however, still refused to admit his mistake, attempting instead to cover it with a false sense of authority. The governor, sensing the officer's discomfort, did not escalate or mock him. He remained professional, simply pointing out facts and following proper procedure. His behavior was a reflection of experience, of leadership, and of an understanding that public perception mattered just as much as legality in moments like this. By calmly correcting the officer, he demonstrated that knowledge and preparation could disarm prejudice. Even without confrontation, the mistake the officer had made was not just procedural, it was a reflection of his bias, and now it was becoming visible to everyone around. The officer glanced around at the growing crowd, feeling their silent observation pressing on him. Every whisper and subtle glance felt heavier, as if judgment hung in the air. He realized, though unwilling to admit it yet, that this was no longer just about him enforcing the law, it was about how he exercised authority, and how quickly a single mistake, fueled by bias, could spiral into public scrutiny. The governor's composure highlighted the error, showing that patience and professionalism could reveal flaws in judgment more clearly than anger or confrontation ever could. Finally, the officer let out a slight sigh, a subtle gesture that did not go unnoticed by the governor or the bystanders. It was the first sign that the weight of his mistake had begun to sink in. His attempt to intimidate had failed, and in its place, respect for the governor's authority, both legal and personal, was beginning to form. He now had a choice: to escalate further and risk exposing his bias completely, or to acknowledge, even quietly, that he had acted improperly. The moment hung in delicate balance, the city around them alive with silent witnesses, and the tension shifting from confrontation to reflection. The governor, still calm, allowed the officer a moment to collect himself, never raising his voice, never making a threat, simply standing firm in the truth and the law. His behavior turned what could have been a humiliating confrontation into a lesson in dignity, accountability, and patience. The officer, now facing the reality of his mistake, began to feel the first stirrings of regret. Though pride still made it difficult to admit openly, the city, the bystanders, and even the hum of traffic seemed to pause in this subtle moment of reckoning. The tension in the air shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the governor leaned back slightly in his seat, maintaining his calm composure. His eyes, still focused on the officer, carried quiet authority, and in them was a message that was impossible to ignore. Dignity and truth would not be shaken. The officer, standing beside the SUV, could no longer hide the unease creeping into his posture. He had thought this would be a simple stop, a routine assertion of authority, but now he realized the gravity of his misjudgment, and the public attention only amplified it. "Officer," the governor began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand your duty to ensure safety and follow protocol, and I respect your role. However, I also believe that every action taken in authority carries responsibility, including the responsibility to remain impartial." His words were measured, precise, and respectful, yet they carried an undeniable weight. The officer shifted slightly, glancing around at the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered, some whispering softly, others recording discreetly. All eyes were now on him, and he felt the pressure of public observation like a tangible force. The governor continued, calmly explaining how minor mistakes or biased assumptions can escalate quickly and damage trust. Every stop, every decision, matters, not just to the individuals involved but to the public watching. It's a reminder that authority is powerful, but it must be exercised wisely. His tone was instructive yet gentle, and for the first time, the officer realized he had underestimated the governor, not just as a leader but as a person who understood both the law and the responsibility that came with it. The subtle firmness in his words began to erode the false sense of control he had clung to. Around them, the bystanders began to sense the shift, their quiet observation turning into a shared understanding of what was unfolding. Phones continued to capture the encounter, but the focus was no longer just on the confrontation. It was on the governor's calm authority and the officer's dawning realization. A few whispered to one another, nodding toward the governor, commenting on his composure. The way he spoke without anger, the way he made the officer confront his own mistake without a single raised voice. It was a lesson in leadership unfolding in real time. The officer, feeling exposed both to the public and to his own conscience, finally took a step back, his voice less sharp. I understand, he said hesitantly, almost under his breath. The governor nodded politely, acknowledging the statement without gloating or judgment. It's never too late to reflect and correct, officer. What matters is that we all learn from our actions. His words carried a sense of forgiveness, not weakness, and that, perhaps more than anything else, unsettled the officer further. The realization that respect and authority could come from calm integrity rather than aggression was starting to sink in. The small crowd continued to watch, feeling the tension ease slightly as the officer's demeanor softened, his rigid posture relaxed, and there was a visible flicker of remorse in his eyes. He had come expecting fear or compliance, but instead, he was faced with humility and calm authority, and it forced him to confront his own biases and assumptions. The governor, without making a scene, had effectively turned the situation around, transforming what could have been a humiliating moment into a lesson in accountability, dignity, and integrity. "Let's ensure this encounter ends respectfully," the governor said, his words carrying quiet authority. "We all have a role to play in ensuring fairness and trust, and we can start by recognizing our responsibilities." It was a simple statement, but in that moment, the officer felt the weight of it, understanding that this encounter would stay with him long after it ended, that the lesson he was receiving was not just about procedure but about character and conduct. The officer nodded again, swallowing his pride, realizing that the morning had taken an unexpected turn. He had entered the situation thinking he held all the power, but the governor's calm, measured responses had shifted the balance completely, forcing the officer to acknowledge his error, reflect on his behavior, and recognize the need for humility. The city moved around them as usual, but for those present, this small street corner had become a stage where integrity and composure had triumphed over arrogance and prejudice. Finally, the officer straightened his uniform, a quiet gesture of respect, and took a deep breath, while the governor maintained his calm, a subtle nod acknowledging the officer's realization. The turnaround moment had arrived, not with shouting or confrontation, but with patience, clarity, and quiet authority, leaving everyone watching with a powerful reminder that true power comes not from dominance but from dignity and integrity. After the encounter, the officer stood by his patrol car, staring at the ground for a moment. The initial rush of authority he had felt was gone, replaced by a gnawing awareness of his mistake. The governor's calm demeanor and polite firmness had forced him to confront something he had ignored for far too long, his own prejudice and assumptions. The city hummed around them, cars moving, pedestrians walking, but for the officer, the world had narrowed to a quiet, uncomfortable reflection. He replayed every word, every gesture, every detail of the stop in his mind, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He realized that he had approached the situation not as a professional tasked with upholding the law, but as someone letting personal bias influence judgment. The governor's polite corrections, his unwavering patience, and his firm adherence to the law had illuminated the officer's errors. And for the first time, he felt the weight of accountability, not as a punishment from others, but as a personal responsibility to acknowledge and change. The governor, meanwhile, slowly drove away, nodding politely to the officer before merging back into traffic. His calm departure left a lasting impression, demonstrating that leadership and integrity could resolve even tense confrontations without humiliation or aggression. Onlookers whispered among themselves, sharing their observations, while some quietly applauded the governor's composure. It became clear that what had seemed like a routine stop had transformed into a teaching moment, one that everyone present would remember for a long time. As the officer returned to his patrol car, he began to think about the larger implications of his actions. He understood that prejudice, no matter how subtle, could influence decisions in dangerous ways, and that public trust was fragile and easily lost. Every day, officers were expected to uphold justice and fairness, and he had momentarily failed to meet that standard. The governor's patience and professionalism had not only exposed the mistake but had also provided a model for how authority should be exercised with humility and respect. Sitting in the patrol car, the officer made a mental note to review his own behavior, to reflect on moments when assumptions had crept into his actions, and to ensure that no personal bias would ever compromise his duty again. He realized that accountability was not just about following the rules, it was about being conscious of one's own thoughts, attitudes, and intentions. He could not change the past, but he could choose to learn from it, to grow, and to ensure that his actions in the future reflected fairness, integrity, and respect. Later that day, the officer found himself thinking about the incident repeatedly, sharing the story cautiously with a trusted colleague, describing how the governor had handled everything calmly, yet firmly, how the public presence had amplified the importance of conduct, and how every action, every word, could either reinforce trust or erode it. The colleague listened silently, nodding, understanding that this encounter was more than a simple traffic stop. It was a mirror reflecting the officer's character and the responsibility that came with power. The incident began to ripple beyond that morning, as news outlets and social media picked up on the story, capturing the encounter from bystanders' recordings. The officer was faced with public scrutiny, and although uncomfortable, it became a catalyst for reflection. Both he and his department recognized the need for better training, awareness, and understanding of how bias could manifest in everyday situations. The governor's calm composure became a benchmark for leadership and accountability, inspiring discussions among law enforcement, city officials, and the community about fairness, respect, and public trust. By the end of the day, the officer realized something profound: humility, reflection, and accountability were more powerful than authority alone, that mistakes, when acknowledged and learned from, could transform a person and even an entire system. He felt a quiet sense of resolve, a commitment to approach every future encounter with fairness and integrity. He understood that real power came from self-awareness, from treating others with dignity, and from learning to act with justice rather than assumption. The governor's calm and composed handling of the stop had not only prevented an unnecessary conflict but had also created an opportunity for growth, not just for the officer, but for everyone who witnessed the event. The lesson was clear: authority carried responsibility, and leadership was measured not by domination, but by patience, respect, and integrity. For the officer, the reflection that began in that quiet moment on the sidewalk would shape his decisions, his conduct, and his understanding of justice for the rest of his career. By the afternoon, the story of the traffic stop had begun to spread rapidly, carried first by the small crowd of onlookers who had recorded the encounter and then through social media, sharing videos and messages across platforms. People everywhere were talking about the incident, not just because a governor had been pulled over, but because of the remarkable way he had handled the situation: calm, polite, and firm. He had turned what could have been a tense confrontation into a lesson in leadership, integrity, and accountability. News outlets picked up the story, adding context and interviews with witnesses who described what they had seen. Some spoke of the officer's initial attitude, others of the governor's composed responses, but all agreed on one thing: the encounter had revealed the power of dignity under pressure. Comment sections filled with reactions from viewers who praised the governor for his calm authority, calling the way he handled the situation inspiring and exemplary. People shared the video repeatedly, amazed at how someone in a position of power could remain humble and measured even when faced with prejudice. Community leaders and advocacy groups began weighing in, highlighting the incident as a perfect example of why fairness and accountability mattered in law enforcement. They praised the governor for demonstrating leadership, courage, and patience, while also calling attention to the need for officers to examine their own biases. The story sparked conversations across the city and the nation, as people debated the broader implications of the encounter, how public figures, law enforcement, and ordinary citizens could navigate moments of tension with integrity and responsibility. The officer himself began to feel the public impact of his actions, seeing comments, posts, and discussions about the incident online. He realized that the crowd of bystanders, who had initially seemed only mildly curious, had become witnesses whose recordings were now influencing public opinion. The realization was sobering, but it also reinforced the importance of accountability. He had underestimated the visibility and weight of every decision made in uniform, and now he had a chance to learn, reflect, and grow from that understanding. Journalists began to interview experts on law enforcement and public relations, who noted that encounters like this could shape perceptions of entire departments. The governor's response was widely held up as a model for public service, demonstrating that calmness and adherence to the law could both de-escalate tension and command respect. Social media influencers, community activists, and even ordinary citizens shared snippets of the encounter, emphasizing how dignity and composure could disarm bias and bring attention to proper conduct. In the local community, people began talking about the incident in workplaces, schools, and neighborhood gatherings, sharing their thoughts on how public accountability and professionalism could influence behavior. Many expressed admiration for the governor, noting that he had handled the situation with tact and patience, turning what could have been a humiliating moment into a teaching opportunity. Meanwhile, discussions about the officer's role in the encounter prompted debates about training, bias, and the importance of fairness in law enforcement. The officer, reflecting on the public reaction, realized that this incident would remain a defining moment in his career. The video, the social media attention, and the news coverage all served as a reminder that actions taken in authority were never private, that public trust was fragile, and that respect, patience, and integrity were more powerful than aggression or assumptions. For him, this was not just about personal regret, but a lesson in professional responsibility and the long-term impact of one's behavior. The governor, aware of the growing attention, did not seek the spotlight but allowed his actions to speak for themselves. The calm, measured way he had handled the encounter had inspired discussions far beyond the city streets, prompting reflection on leadership, accountability, and the importance of treating others with respect. From news outlets to social media feeds, everyone seemed to agree, this was more than a traffic stop. It was a demonstration of how courage, composure, and integrity could influence not only a single encounter but the wider public consciousness. By evening, the city seemed to settle, but the story lingered, circulating through conversations, posts, and news segments, reminding everyone of the power of example, of patience, and of dignity under pressure. The encounter had become a symbol of accountability and leadership, a moment that demonstrated how one person's calm composure could create ripple effects far beyond a single street, and how the public, as witnesses and participants, played a role in reinforcing fairness and justice. Days after the traffic stop, the story continued to ripple through the city and beyond. People discussed it in homes, offices, schools, and community centers, reflecting on how a moment that could have been tense and confrontational instead became a lesson in dignity, patience, and leadership. The governor's composed handling of the encounter remained the focus, showing that calm authority and respect could influence even those initially resistant to guidance. His actions became a benchmark for behavior under pressure, a demonstration of how integrity and professionalism could turn conflict into opportunity. The officer, meanwhile, had taken time to reflect deeply on what had occurred. He replayed every detail, every exchange, understanding more clearly the impact of bias, assumptions, and authority misused. The incident was now a mirror, reflecting not only his behavior but also the expectations society held for those in positions of power. He recognized that every interaction mattered, every decision carried weight, and that personal growth required humility, awareness, and accountability. The experience left him with a quiet determination to act differently in the future, to be fair, to observe carefully, and to approach every encounter with respect. Training programs within the police department began incorporating the incident as an example of both caution and inspiration. Officers were shown the recording and the sequence of events, emphasizing how bias could affect judgment and how composure, professionalism, and adherence to law could diffuse potential conflict. the governor's response became a case study, demonstrating the power of leadership that was calm, principled, and fair. These lessons were not just about policing, but about human behavior, empathy, and the responsibility to act ethically in all situations. Community members continued to share their perspectives online, expressing admiration for how the governor had handled the stop, highlighting the importance of accountability, and encouraging dialogue about fairness and equality. The incident sparked broader conversations about respect, public service, and the ways leaders could inspire through actions rather than words. People began to see that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was measured, patient, and firm in its simplicity, yet no less powerful. The officer, having reflected on the encounter, began to share his experience privately with colleagues and peers, discussing what he had learned, how public perception, personal bias, and professional responsibility intersected, and how a single incident could serve as a turning point for personal growth. By acknowledging his mistakes and embracing the lessons, he not only improved himself but also contributed to a culture of awareness and accountability within his department. The experience became a guidepost for him, reminding him daily that integrity and fairness were not optional, they were essential. The governor, unaware of just how far his actions had reached, continued his public duties with the same dedication and focus, but the story had already left a lasting imprint, inspiring not only law enforcement but also everyday citizens to reflect on their behavior, their judgments, and their interactions with others. It reminded people that leadership could be quiet yet commanding, humble yet effective, and that personal integrity had the power to influence others far beyond the immediate moment. As weeks passed, educators, community leaders, and even political figures referenced the incident, using it to illustrate the importance of fairness, patience, and respect in every interaction. From classrooms to professional seminars, the encounter became a teaching tool, showing how composure under pressure could disarm tension and create understanding. The city, which had witnessed the event firsthand or through recordings, began to embrace the story as an example of accountability, courage, and ethical behavior. Ultimately, the traffic stop that could have been remembered as an embarrassing confrontation became instead a defining moment of leadership, responsibility, and human dignity. Both the governor and the officer carried lessons forward, one reinforcing the power of calm authority, the other learning the value of reflection and accountability. The incident reminded everyone involved, and those who observed it, that every action mattered, every choice had consequences, and that courage and integrity could transform even the most ordinary moments into lasting influence. The city continued its daily rhythm, but the memory of that morning lingered, a quiet reminder that fairness, patience, and respect were not abstract ideals, but practical tools capable of shaping behavior, resolving tension, and inspiring others. It was a story that would be told, remembered, and reflected upon for years, demonstrating that even in moments of potential conflict, dignity, leadership, and ethical action could leave a permanent, positive mark on both individuals and the community.